was going to say, I don't give much thought to what I'm going to talk about in a satsang, because the topic is, in a way, quite narrow. I've said it many times that really it's always about happiness in daily living, which really means peace of mind. In practical terms, happiness is available on a continuous, unbroken basis in the form of peace of mind. And it's important for that to be made clear, because if I say it's about happiness, most people think, oh, that's not what I'm looking for. I'm a spiritual seeker, and seeking happiness is actually part of the problem. That's what people have been doing. They've been seeking happiness, and that's looking in the wrong direction. Well, actually, I think if we keep it practical and we really look at our experience and align the concepts that we have with a practical, so when we stop kidding ourselves and when we start really trying to keep the concepts that we hold aligned, we will say, actually, all I'm looking for is to be happy in this life. And I haven't found that happiness when I've been seeking outcomes, when I've been seeking pleasure, when I've been seeking for happiness in the flow of life. Now that's accurate. But that doesn't mean that we're not looking for happiness. It just means that happiness isn't to be found in pleasure. And so historically what we mean by happiness is, or what we think of as happiness, is the pleasurable feelings, a joyous feeling, the absence of pain. And so because that's our previous association of what happiness means, that happiness is some sort of pleasure or a positive outcome, or something that comes when things are going well, when we're on holiday, when we're having a good time with friends, when we're doing things we like. Then if we hear this, what we're really looking for is happiness, it might not gel. So I'm asserting in the concept, yes, we are looking for happiness, but let's be very clear that happiness is not to be found where we have been looking for it in the way that we tend to develop naturally as humans. We tend to be forced into an outlook of, yes, I'm looking for happiness and it's to be found in outcomes. And then when we start getting an inkling that we're not going to find the deeper happiness, the real, a more fundamental sense of contentment and meaning, isn't going to be found in outcomes. It isn't going to be found in getting very rich. It isn't going to be found in having a particular relationship. It isn't going to be found because of the perfect job. We start getting an inkling of that, and then we say, oh no, I'm not looking for happiness. So I suggest that you consider, yes, you are looking for happiness, but let's be very clear that happiness, as it's available to the human being on a continuous, unbroken basis, the happiness that is referred to in spiritual teachings, and they may well not use the word happiness because it might confuse the situation. But the fact that they might not use it and it confuses it doesn't mean that at some point it can be very helpful for us to say, actually, I'm just looking to be happy. And maybe I've been looking for happiness in the wrong place. So the happiness that is available on a continuous, unbroken basis is happiness through peace of mind. So we can just call it peace of mind if you like. What's available, what spiritual teachings have been talking about, is peace of mind. Now, once again, a lot of spirituality or non-dual teachings or non-duality doesn't focus on the world of form. It doesn't focus on daily living. So if we then say, well, if I put forward the suggestion, what we're really looking for, whether we realize it or not, is peace of mind in daily living, then once again, a whole range of listeners might say, oh, not what I'm looking for. What I'm looking for is a transcendence, the end of the person, the seeing through the illusion of form. And so just peace of mind, they might be acceptable to, so, and then you say peace of mind in daily living, and so, oh no, that's not real understanding. Once again, I think there's a reason why I'm emphasizing these particular aspects rather than just sticking to the other methodology. And so anyway, today's satsang, it seems, is going to be about a couple of things, because just at the beginning it came to me, there's a couple of things I want to address. One is this notion that the end of suffering or peace of mind just isn't available. You often see discussions online where someone might ask a question or put forward a proposition about peace of mind, and then there's a whole lot of comments or inputs, opinions that say, anyone who says that they don't suffer or that peace of mind is available is kidding themselves. They're maybe overlooking their own experience. They're convinced that maybe they have peace of mind, but in fact they don't. There's a whole lot of skepticism, I guess, or difference of opinion about what the seeking is really about. And I when I read this, I don't tend to want to make comment on these things because it's not necessarily what it's about. But in this particular instance, giving a talk on, I'd like to make it clear that the change that has happened for me is that there is peace of mind in daily living. And peace of mind is the absence, the end, the non-arising of a whole lot of forms of suffering that used to arise prior to seeking and changed over the course of the seeking to the point where I experience life now where I can say that suffering in relation to events that happen doesn't happen. Now let's be clear on what that suffering is, because that statement might get heard by someone and say, oh really? You wouldn't suffer if someone dropped a brick on your foot. You wouldn't suffer if a loved one died. And we have to be clear on what suffering is. Suffering is not the same as pain. So the pain will carry on in the flow of life. Events are going to be either pleasurable or painful. And just diverting back, if someone hears it and says, oh, he says he doesn't suffer anymore, so I can hurt him. And it's all the same for him, whether I hurt him or not. And I'd like to make it clear, I'm not saying that suffering means that whether I receive pleasure or pain is all the same with me. So I don't want anyone out there to think, oh, I'll show him. Because I'm very happy for my life to have as little pain as possible and as much pleasure. But I understand that the amount of pleasure and pain that I am destined to receive is not in my control. And life is inevitably going to be a mix of pleasure and pain, sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. The change that has happened is that when there is pain, the relationship to that pain is very different to the relationship that used to arise previously. Previously, when certain ways of seeing life were different, pain would be taken to mean something about who I am. Outcomes would be taken to be a reflection of who I am as a person, or a reflection of how I know myself. And essentially, positive outcomes would tend to lead to a more inflated or a more positive sense of self. And negative outcomes or painful outcomes would tend to lead to a sense of inadequacy, or feel like that was an attack or a diminishing of who I am. And that inflation or sense of inadequacy or deflation, attack on the level of who I am, is very different to pain. It is an addition to the pleasure or pain of the actual circumstance, and it is a psychological sense of self that is not the sense of self that is much less changing than that, much less vulnerable than the psychological sense of self that is heavily linked to outcomes. And often the outcomes are about what someone has done or what someone thinks about us, and that tends to reinforce the deeply ingrained belief we have about ourselves. And when we have a psychological sense of self that is linked to outcomes, and because the outcomes in life are not always positive or delivering good outcomes, at a very early age, our sense of self becomes very variable and inconsistent. It's a sense of self that is filled with doubt, filled with judgment, because we are not able to deliver perfection. And because everyone else around us tends to have a sense of self, which is a psychological sense of self that feels inflated when outcomes are positive and feels attacked when the outcomes are negative, there tends to be a lot of feedback whenever we deliver pain to the other, feedback that tells us that we are wrong, and that feedback from the other is really coming from a defensive sense of who they are that requires life around them to be perfect in order for them to feel less suffering. And so if we're growing up in that environment, we're bound to feel like we are less than good enough. Because essentially we are being told over and over again that is the case. Not necessarily directly, but by the way that other people will respond and the way that we interpret that response. So when we look at this topic more clearly or more closely, and we see that there is a difference between pleasure and pain, which is a biological reaction to the outcome in the flow of life, and that biological reaction is based on how the outcome interacts with our biological preference. So whether the outcome is in line with the things that we like, if that's the case, then there is going to be pleasure. And if the outcome is not in line with the things that we like, then there will be pain. Now, that pleasure or pain is, in a sense, limited to the event itself. With the psychological self in place, it tends to get extended horizontally in time. And what gets extended horizontally in time is not so much the biological reaction, but the additional load of the psychological reaction, which is really a narrative about what that event means about who I am and means to me. So once we become clear that the event itself and suffering are two different forms. That suffering is always one's attitude to the circumstance, one's way of relating to what has happened, what has been said about you, the outcome that you've achieved or not achieved as part of a goal. Once it becomes clear that the suffering, the uncomfortableness in life is not limited to circumstance, but is mostly about our attitude to the circumstance. And we start to see that uncomfortableness arises in the form of guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation. And we start to see that those different arisings inside of us, the guilt, the blame, the pride, the worry, and the expectation, are all based on a certain presupposition about how things happen, about what the outcomes actually mean to me. And if certain variables change, then the narrative that was able to be sustained previously might start to be undermined. And if we find that in certain situations, the blame towards the other or the blame towards ourselves starts to get diminished because we can't judge ourselves or judge the other the same way, because let's say an explanation was given to us that makes sense, that demonstrates, for example, using a concept within this teaching, that each of us are functioning in each moment according to our very specific design, and that design is a result of what life has put in place and not what Roger has chosen, not a result of what Roger was in control of. And so that rationale essentially undermines the belief in personal doership, which is a deeply ingrained part of that psychological sense of self and part of the psychological suffering. And if that starts to be investigated and starts to be inquired into and starts to make more and more sense, eventually the attitude that we have towards the actions that have happened in the past, both my actions and the other's actions, and the way that we experience outcomes, i.e. we start to maybe realize that our happiness isn't dependent on what others think about us, that our happiness isn't dependent on everything always going perfectly, always being pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. And we start to see that a large part of our uncomfortableness that is driving us towards outcomes and the investment and the identification with outcomes is actually the presence of the uncomfortableness. And so as that uncomfortableness starts to diminish, we might start to need outcomes to be always perfect, less than we did before. And so as these relationships to life start changing, we might start to see the levels of suffering start to diminish. So let's take blame towards the other for something that they think about us, or for the fact that they didn't turn up when they said they were going to turn up, or didn't call us when they said they were going to call us. If within our system, the old way of feeling hatred towards the other, now hatred's a strong word, but when you look at your attitude towards the other, even when they do something relatively small, if it's taken personally, it's a form of hating the other for what they have not delivered to you or what they have delivered to you, pain. And if that stops making sense, if we see that that is a movement that is actually delivering an extra layer of uncomfortableness on top of the pain, and if it starts changing, the important part is if it starts changing, because it isn't just about it being an intellectual justification. It needs to be an understanding that starts off as an intellectual justification and then rewires the system in such a way that that narrative no longer happens. The automatic narrative that has the uncomfortableness in it. If that stops arising, at least in part, in relation to some actions, then there's no reason why it can't continue to infiltrate, such that the blame in more and more situations gets cut off. When we look at blame, there's a common principle to blame. And so what is misunderstood when someone says, suffering can't end completely, it's a statement that is based, in my view, on a not understanding on what suffering is. When we do start to see what suffering is, and we see that it's about our attitude, and we see that our attitude is based on a certain belief or set of ways of seeing life, seeing the other as the doer, seeing outcomes as something that is essential to who I am, if we see that that's what the blame and the shame is based on, if we see that that's what the expectation about the future is based on, then it starts to change. And if it's a common principle and it's started to change in relation to 20% of the outcomes, then there's no reason why it can't change in relation to all of the outcomes once it has been understood in relation to the range of different sorts of pain that are delivered in life. And so this is, in a way, a bit of, or one of the paradoxes. So we often hear that understanding is not intellectual. It isn't about you thinking the liberation into existence. And from one perspective, that's quite true. Why it's said and why it's true is that the doership and the attachment to outcomes part of ourself is because we have a conceptual sense of self that has formed and it's very strong. That means a psychological sense of who we are. And what we mean by a psychological sense of who we are is an identity has been put in place based on a whole lot of conclusions from past outcomes. So an example could be a child whose parents get divorced, and then the narrative says, that's my fault. They got divorced because of me. And so that's that's an example of the psychological self, which is a sense of self based on a conclusion or a concept. And when we look at that from outside, as another person looking in, we go, but that's not true. The parents didn't get divorced because of you. The parents got divorced because of very complex reasons. And yet, from the child's point of view, it can seem like it was absolutely about me. And so once that's put in place, that becomes part of who they know themselves as. The one that is not good enough, let's say, for the parents to want to stay together. Or the one that is not good enough and caused the divorce because they're not a good enough child. And so that psychological sense of self, which at its root is based in concept, tends to want to work life out conceptually. And so because so much of the attitude towards life has been about thinking about what has happened and reacting from this sense of self, the assumption is that, I have to think differently. As in, I have to create thoughts that are positive thoughts instead of negative thoughts, for example. And the freedom from suffering isn't about changing your thoughts, changing the content of your thoughts from, let's say, negative thoughts to positive thoughts. It's about a set of thoughts that emanate from the psychological self dissolving, not arising, which really means it's about the psychological self dissolving. It's not about the psychological self morphing into a positive psychological self instead of a negative psychological self. Now, a positive psychological self will feel better than a negative psychological self, but it won't be free. It won't be the freedom from the psychological self that is being pointed at. And so that's why we are often told that peace of mind is not something that you need to think into existence. It's not intellectual. It is about tapping into the essence of who we are, and we're told, the essence of who we are is consciousness or awareness or God. And that self-realization is the realization, the actual experiential embodiment of what it is that we really are. And I would agree that from a certain angle, that concept is very useful and accurate enough, as is the concept that says it's not about the intellect. That peace of mind is not about understanding things intellectually. And when we look at it, if we put that explanation aside, saying, yes, that is correct, it is a good explanation trying to make a point, and so those are the concepts that are chosen to make that point, to help bring about the change. It is encouraging someone that is trying to work out an answer. It is encouraging them to stop trying to work out the answer in the intellect, because ultimately the piece of knowing ourselves, you could say, is a piece of a stopping of the narrative that I described at the beginning of the satsang that feels so uncomfortable. And that narrative stops when the psychological sense of self starts to get weakened enough for it not to keep going into a conceptual solution. And in a way, that's what the concept in this teaching that says your happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life is encouraging or pointing towards. Because the flow of life means outcomes, and looking for happiness in the flow of life is happens when we are thinking about the future, thinking about the past and wishing that something didn't happen, trying to figure out how to fix things that are unfixable in the past. And so it's trying to point us inward, which is a completely different direction to the direction the psychological self has been shaped to move in. And so by pointing us away from looking for happiness in outcomes, by pointing us to a place outside of thinking, essentially if we start to see a movement that starts off slowly at first, and we see a movement away from that obsessive thinking, what's essentially happening is the psychological self is dissolving. There isn't a psychological self and its thinking. There is, they are one and the same thing. The thinking and the beliefs that we can call the psychological self are not two things. That is the thinking and the feeling of suffering is the psychological self in movement. And so each time there is a dropping into being, presence, which means to let go of the obsession with finding the answer, with being right, with making the other person know that they are wrong or that they've hurt you, without trying to balance the ledger up, and just dropping into the present moment, out of that attempt to shift the content of circumstance. Essentially, that happens when we realize it's not really important, because that's not where my true self is to be found. The psychological self has a lot of trouble in stopping. The psychological self feels very challenged by outcomes and wants to set the record straight so that it gets to a position where it doesn't feel as challenged. And so the capacity to drop out of that narrative into the recognition that I am and that life is, and to drop out of something that happened 2 minutes ago, 10 minutes ago, and come back here, that's very hard for the psychological self to do. And when it happens, it means the psychological self is diminishing, is weakening. And so here's the other side of the paradox, is that you will see in your own seeking that peace is not to be found in thinking peace into existence as a thought that creates the peace or creates the happiness. So it's not about a new thought creating the happiness, it's about cutting off of the thoughts that create the uncomfortableness, which is really our unhappiness, the uncomfortableness with the other, and ultimately an uncomfortableness with oneself. We'll see that for ourselves. And what I think is very important is to appreciate what leads to that movement. And what leads to the movement is an intellectual understanding that deepens to the point where the intellect realizes that happiness is to be found in its stopping. And so spiritual teachings are using a whole range of concepts and techniques. Some will use the technique of saying it has nothing to do with the intellect. And who are they talking to? They're talking to the intellect. And yet saying it has nothing to do with the intellect, which doesn't make the teaching at all wrong. It's just the particular methodology that has been chosen. And another teaching might explain that it is the intellect that eventually realizes that if it doesn't stop, it is perpetuating a state that is not the presence. So the presence is not thinking. It has got nothing to do with the intellect. The actual absence of suffering is not an intellectual thought. It is the absence of the thinking mind, which is part of the intellect. The thinking mind is referred to in this teaching as the guilt, the blame, the pride, the worry, and the expectation. And underneath all of that, guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation, you could collapse all of those down into many different forms of guilt, many different forms of blame, many different forms of pride, many different forms of worry and expectation. And under that range of headings, under blame, under guilt, you will see that the vast range of different interactions that you have can fit in to the subcategories that all are covered by guilt and blame and pride and worry and expectation. And so as that is appreciated, then those narratives start to get cut off. Once we start to appreciate that that is based on the belief in doership and attachment to outcome, and we might see that that is not actually how life is, that's not the truth. And once we see that, for example, my happiness is not to be found in outcomes, it's to be found in stopping, then when we see the narrative of expecting the future to look a certain way, we might realize that's based in error. That's based in ignorance. That's based in the sense of self that is convinced that I am added to by positive outcomes and by success, and I am diminished by failings. And so as we start finding this presence, which is the stopping of that psychological self-narrative, then it becomes abundantly clear that our happiness or peace of mind or liberation, enlightenment, is not to be found out there, which gives us more and more reason, gives the intellect as it starts to put ticks next to the concepts, and as the intellectual understanding goes deeper and deeper, and it goes deeper and deeper when the concepts stop being just intellectual concepts but start to be confirmed experientially based on your own life experience. And so once we start seeing expectation about what tomorrow will look like or what today should look like, once we start seeing that as a form of suffering, we might see a movement that says, enough, stop, step out of this. And the stepping out of it is just the thought process stopping in that instant. It doesn't even need to get to the end of the thought that says, oh, I wish that today was sunny, for example. At the I wish, you might already know where the thought is going, and it's I wish, and something might arise that says stop. So if we don't get given clear intellectual concepts that are received by the intellect and are then investigated by the intellect in the course of daily living, then this particular stopping is less likely to become something that arises every time the different forms of suffering come up, because our internal radar hasn't been given enough information to understand the suffering for what it really is. So we might, for example, be given an explanation, a concept that says you are not a person. What you are is awareness. And once again, that is in a teaching because it's useful. Why is it useful? It's useful because it is a way of cutting off suffering, but it may be more effective at introducing a cutting off of suffering, but it may not be effective as at penetrating down to all of the different forms of suffering. So I'll give you an example of why it can be useful if we are told that we're not a person, that what we are is formless awareness, and we are given a series of techniques or a series of pointers that create an awakening to the formless aspect of the human being, the awareness aspect of the human being. And we have an experiential appreciation that the aware part of the human, the beingness, and frankly, at that point where there's the that realization, there probably isn't any explanation that has said that is the aware part of the human being. It's just saying that's what you are. And so when that awakening happens, the experience is where attention is all on the formless aspect. And so it's awareness, aware of itself. And so there's no appreciation that we are anything other than the awareness. And with that experiential appreciation of the fact that what I am, and in that awakening, it is confirmed, oh, this is what you've always been, and it has gone unnoticed. The notion that you are not a person becomes something that's not just a concept, but it's something that has been revealed. And with that being available and being described as the truth, the enlightenment or awakening in some forms, or sometimes that is that knowing yourself as awareness is said to be, it. And so we then, the seeker can have something that motivates a movement into beingness, and at the same time it is a concept that becomes part of the intellect. It might not be appreciated as part of the intellect, that says I'm not a person, and I am the person is the form, and I am the formless, and it's experiential. And so any narrative of suffering is always about the form, what is happening to the form, or what is happening to the emotion, what people are thinking about who I am, or what people are doing or not doing, people are agreeing or disagreeing. And so all suffering is about what I do, what the other has done, outcomes, the future and the past. And so if we're given a concept that says you are not a person, then all of that thinking gets cut off by the very deepening understanding that I am not a person, based on the awakening to the formless awareness aspect of the person, I would say. But you don't say that if the approach is to create the awakening to the formless awareness. That might come later on. So the benefit of this realization that I am not a person, which I'm not putting forward as some absolute truth. I'm not saying, oh, finally Roger is saying I'm not a person. I'm trying to highlight that different teachings are effective because they undermine the suffering narrative. And when the suffering narrative is undermined, there is peace of mind. What we want is that suffering narrative to be undermined on a continuous basis so that it is effective in daily living. Now, what a seeker who has realized this formless aspect of themselves and is probably convinced that liberation or enlightenment is seeing through form and is therefore focused on transcending daily life, at some point they might realize that this is becoming hard work to keep insisting that I'm not a person and dropping into this formless awareness. And I suggest that's the case, that ends up becoming hard work because it's not the truth. At some point, an integration needs to happen where we maybe recognize as a seeker that actually maybe I'm a little deluded in a way. Maybe I'm bypassing using this concept that I'm not a person. Now, having said that, this isn't a criticism or saying that those teachings are doing anyone a disservice. Not at all. They, as I've pointed out, they've chosen a methodology that will, one, create an awakening to the formless aspect that I call the formless aspect of the person. And not only are they creating this awakening to the formless aspect, but it is somewhat effective to have denounced your personhood. It's somewhat effective at cutting off suffering. And every time the suffering is cut off, it demonstrates that peace is available even in the face of circumstance that hasn't gone so well. So what happens is circumstance happens, someone lets you down, the suffering arises, and then the thought comes up, no, what you are is not a person, this hasn't hurt you, and maybe allows you to rest in the appreciation of the formless, so that experience, the direct sense of being non-localized formless awareness can set in, and there is peace. And what we tend to then find is we get dragged back into the story, into form, and then we have to keep reminding ourselves, no, I'm not person, come back to formless awareness. And it's weakening the structure, it's weakening the system. However, it's doing so without necessarily undermining the structure as it needs to be undermined as the process unfolds further and further. And if that's as far as our seeking goes, and that's if our realization remains in that position, we end up seeing that life is filled with flip-flopping in and out of this sense of being a person and not a person. So once again, I hope that people aren't hearing this as if it's a criticism on the teachings. That's not the point. The point is that the teachings, in their different ways, are trying to bring about an interference with the psychological self. And that psychological self can be interfered with in several different ways. And if we're going to reintegrate into the experience of being a person, which I suggest that sometimes we need to, at some point we need to do, because of the realization that might happen, is the realization is even if this experience of life is not as true as I used to see it, primarily because we have opened, there has been an awakening to the fact that the world of form, the table and the tree and the other people, can be seen as not absolutely form, but can also be seen from the perspective of being objects arising in consciousness, which ultimately means that they are made of consciousness. And if consciousness is formless, then the objects that appear to be form, from a certain way of looking at it, are formless. And so if the world of form is ultimately formless, it's not necessarily as real as we used to see it when we thought the world of form was only form. But at some point we have this realization that I can't go round insisting that the world is not real all the time, because that's a bit like playing or being a character in a computer game who is always, their role is to denote or to denounce what's happening in the computer game. And if you're a character in a dream or in a computer game, sure, some of your journey might be to realize that it may not be as real as was previously seen, but is that how you're going to live the whole of the computer game out? Being the one that is saying, hey, that's not real, none of this is real, I'm not real. Or is there a point where you go, it might not be real, but I'm as unreal as everything else. And so the point might be to live as if I am the character, live as if the computer game is reality. And the as if doesn't mean pretending. It might mean the surrender to the fact that for as long as the computer game continues to have a time frame, as long as the computer game continues to unfold, it needs, I am the character in that computer game. Now, when we're seeking truth, which is how we can start off in our seeking sometimes, depending on what our seeking destiny looks like, truth is often what appeals to us when there's suffering. It's like, I just want the truth, because we've lived a life of essentially seeing things incorrectly, having a sense of self which is not in line with who we really are, let's say. And so that suffering gives us an intuitive feel that I'm looking for the truth. I'm looking for what I can't see yet. And so when we're seeking the truth and we start to get appreciations into aspects of life that we haven't had before, we might then conclude that's what it's all about. It's about seeing what I didn't see before. And it is on the one hand, but maybe it's seeing what we didn't see before is part of a movement towards something quite different to the appreciation of one of the aspects that wasn't seen before. And yet, in order to get where we're going, we do need to see things that we didn't see before. But if we get too hung up on the fact that it's all about seeing, understanding, let's say, the awareness aspect of the human being, or if we get too hung up on the fact that it's about seeing that life is not real, and I'm not putting that forward as an absolute truth, it's something that is a way of explaining certain insights, but they're not necessarily insights that are the truth. So if we are seeking truth, then this living as if I am a person, living as if I am the doer even, will be something that we won't come to. We won't think it's about that. If, however, we realize that we started off seeking the truth because we were unhappy, and if it clicks and says, actually what I'm really looking for is just to be happy in life, and for a while diminishing the reality of life served a purpose. It allowed me to feel more peace because I was less involved in the importance of what someone said about me, or certain outcomes, or the fact that I wasn't particularly successful relative to other people. And by saying that life is not real, it interfered with my old pattern of comparison between myself and the other. It interfered with the narrative of inadequacy, because now we have a new mission, and that is, I have seen the truth. And we can create a narrative of specialness, which doesn't feel as bad as the narrative of inadequacy. And so we have to hopefully these things reveal themselves. So, having said all of that about life not being real, and how that's not necessarily absolutely true, but it's an important realization, I wanted to talk a little bit about how we might see that, and in what context it's correct, or why it's described that way, why life is described as an illusion or unreal, or why we might be able to say that all there is consciousness, that form is just an appearance. One of the challenges that wisdom teachings are trying to overcome is the separation that has been created on the level of the psychological self, the separation that has been created on the level of the intellect that has experienced life from the perspective of a body, from a very young age and has seen a whole lot of objects outside of the body. And without us knowing it, this experience of life, coupled with the fact that we have an intellect that thinks, and the fact that we have a language that is able to label and describe all of the objects that we experience in life with a particular name. And on top of that, given that our experience is that each object delivers a different sensation when it's experienced by us. And so that particular experience of life, which is the standard default way that we develop from a baby into a child and so on, experiencing life in a way that is what we could say a life of form from the perspective of the body. The psychological self is formed in a way that separates, that knows itself as separate from everything else. And one of the key endeavors is to short circuit that perspective of life so that it can be seen to be only a relative perspective rather than the absolute way that things are. If our experience changes because it's short-circuited in a particular way, then our intellect, having experienced something different from what has been experienced consistently for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, 70 years, whatever it happens to be, if essentially a glitch, what appears relative to the past, a glitch happens and life is then known, experienced differently, everything that we have assumed to be truth needs to be questioned and has grounds on which to be questioned, grounds greater than the grounds of just being told life is not as it appears. Life is not a life of separation, but it's a life of oneness or unity, non-duality. If our experience can be short-circuited, the experience of separation short-circuited, then a whole lot of essentially numbers have been filled in, the equivalent of numbers being filled in on the Sudoku board, and your options, now that some pieces of the puzzle have been filled in, the options may unfold further, or the progress may unfold further because some key bits of information have been delivered. And so this describing life as one, in order to create a shift in perspective that sees it, not intellectualizes it. This is the mistake, when it's not really a mistake, it's a limitation, that when there is this, when essentially the pathways, the neural pathways, are grooved in a way that sees everything as outside of who I am and separate, then we're going to often try and think about the oneness and try and think how everything is non-dual and understand it. So we hear these pointers and then we go into thinking, and the pointers themselves are designed to snap us out of that thinking into a direct realization of what is described as oneness. Now, I'm not saying that that direct realization is the truth. It may seem like the truth, but really it's just another perspective, another way that the experience of life can be constructed in a particular moment. And we don't construct it. We are part of the construction of the momentary experience. And this is what one of the things we might not appreciate, that the momentary experience of life is exactly that. It's a construction that is ultimately a construction of consciousness. And so the oneness that is often pointed to is a oneness of consciousness, meaning everything is made of consciousness. So if I borrow an analogy that we are probably able to intellectualize easier to start with than intellectualizing or experiencing. Ultimately, we need to experience the oneness of consciousness. But to first intellectualize an analogy or a comparison, a simile maybe, can help. It can help the shift from one platform to the other. So the example is in physics, we might talk about everything being made of energy. That the wood and the metal are essentially made up of smaller components. And so we go from seeing the wood as a single piece of wood, and we know that if we look at it with a microscope, we can see the many different wood particles making up the big piece of wood. And if we go smaller than wood particles, we start getting into atoms and molecules. And then we can start getting into subatomic particles, where you've got nucleuses and electrons moving very quick. And so from in that example, we've gone from the world of form and solidness down to the world of energy and fast moving energy. And so the oneness really is, in this example, is the oneness of energy. It's a sea. The world is a sea of molecules. And if you go smaller than the molecules, a sea of energy, which really means that our intellect might be able to grasp that on the surface, the tree looks different from the water. But then we might start to realize that, okay, the tree is made up of a lot of small particles and the water is made up of a lot of small particles. And someone might argue, correctly so, that the water element, the water molecules, are different to the wood molecules. And if you go down another level, where you go to the building blocks of the wood molecules and the building blocks of the water molecules, you suddenly get to this soup of homogeneous building blocks. And so we can intellectually maybe appreciate that the world of form is a world of actually homogeneous. It's a homogeneous soup, where even the gap, the air between the wood and the water, or the gap between the tree and the bench, is also these small particles that are the same. When we go beyond the world of form, we might start to appreciate the homogeneousness of the whole world and appreciate the paradox of separation and non-separation, or apparent separateness, and yet appreciate the underlying oneness of everything being essentially made of the same stuff. Now, that realization is not the same as the realization that everything is made of consciousness. That realization is the realization that everything is made of very small particles, or if you go even smaller than small particles, to energy, and if you go even smaller than the energy itself, which is a measurement, you go to nothing. And yet it's sort of parallel. It's not the same realization as the realization everything is made of consciousness. But it, as I said, an appreciation of that example might help make the leap as to what is being pointed at when we are told everything is made of consciousness. All there is consciousness. Or all there is awareness. Everything is made of awareness. It's all arising in it's one big soup of awareness, or one big soup of consciousness. So this is where you might want to put your intellect that I've been talking to. I've been talking to the intellect to help frame something that will be realized outside of the intellect. And I'll continue to talk to the intellect, but hopefully in a way where there is access to that which is outside of the intellect. In order to experience the oneness of consciousness, I suggest that everyone who would like and is listening become very aware of the space that exists right now where you are. And for a lot of us, that will be the experience of a room with walls and doors and windows and furniture. Probably a computer monitor. And if we can let go of the notion, for the purpose of this exploration, of a world out there, let go of the notion of a past or a future, and really just appreciate that which is here right now. We're starting off on the level of form, or what we know as form. And in doing this, I would suggest that you don't focus on anything in particular. Allow your field of vision to be as relaxed as possible. Not necessarily moving your sight around, but rather allowing the entire room, let's say, to be seen. And it doesn't have to be seen in precise details. The sides of the room what's in your peripheral vision will be, indistinct. But there can be an appreciation that the field of vision is expansive, not necessarily expansive beyond what is visible, just it holds everything that is visible. So there's a wall in front of you, window to your right, a bookshelf, a table, computer screen, and all is within the field of awareness. Now, when you go to a museum, an art museum, art gallery, and you see a painting, a big painting, let's say, and it might have lots of objects in it, and attention might rest on each of the separate individual objects in the painting, a bird, a cow, some people, a gate, and you're looking at each of the individual objects. And that's possible, to see the individual object. And yet, it's easier when you're looking at a painting to pull back and appreciate that all of the seemingly separate objects are part of a single object, image, single painting. And so, in your appreciation of the present moment, the room you're in, you might be able to acknowledge that there are, on one level, many different objects, and yet appreciate that they are a bit like the painting, all components of a singular experience. Now, you might also want to drop the notion, the concept, that it is the body that is aware of the room. I'm not saying it's not the body, I'm just saying it doesn't need to be insisted on. The fact that for a long time, for our whole life, life has been experienced from the perspective of the body and seen as a world outside of me, tends to have maybe ingrained the assumption that the body is what is aware. And in moments like this, when you're doing the exploration, having softened your gaze, allowing the whole experience to arise within the awareness of the experience. Maybe it's not the eyes doing the seeing. And at any point you can include sound as part of this momentary experience. Not only the visual field, but all sound objects that arise and fall are arising and falling within this field of awareness, just like the visual objects. And there may be several sounds, but they too are like separate, they might seem like separate components, but they're actually making up the singular soundscape. So they're not as separate as they might appear from a certain perspective. So remember the painting in the art gallery, we can see the objects as separate and we can appreciate them as part of a whole. And we're able to do that in the present moment with the visual objects and the sound objects, and then we can stitch both the visual and the sound objects and the smell objects and the taste objects and the touch objects and the thought objects and the emotion objects, all in to the singular multisensory experience of the present moment. So in the same way as all of the visual objects can be seen as separate and yet as one, we can also see all of the sound objects compared to all of the sight objects as two separate senses, or we can see them as two components of the singular multisensory experience. And none of this requires any thought. It is all just about experiencing. Experiencing that I'm describing. And in that knowing the experience as it is, it might become apparent that all of the sound objects, sight objects, smell objects, touch objects, the lowest common denominator, the soup of which they are made, is awareness. And it is the awareness in which they all arise that is aware of itself, is aware of the experience. And the experience is ever changing. The sounds are changing, the sights are changing, not necessarily radically. Trees can be swaying, curtains can be blowing, people can be moving. And so the world of form may not be as absolutely form as we might think. It can be known differently. And if what we know as closing your eyes were to happen, you might find yourself able to remain aware of the experience that has changed radically from one moment to the next. And what hasn't gone away is awareness, the soup of experience that exists with what we call eyes closed is still a soup of awareness. The content is changed, it's always changing. So the sense of amness, I am, existence, not the existence of the body, but the existence of that which is aware, that which is, that which exists, remains whether there is the world of apparent form, trees and tables and chairs and people and cars, or in what we call eyes closed, which if you go beyond the notion that I just have my eyes closed and find yourself aware of the experience that arises with what we call eyes closed, then you find that the sense of self, the sense of awareness, the sense of existence is still there and is inherent in the awareness that is the background of all experience. Now, if some of you have maybe appreciated that the life experience that you've always had, a life experience that has been known to you as the life of form, the life of the world outside of me, which when you look at it is the world outside of the body. Some of you might have realized that the world of form, including the body, which is part of the world of form, arises within the field of consciousness or the field of awareness. They're interchangeable words in this context. And that the world of form is really made up of a soup, or is a soup of consciousness. Appearance, both visual, sight, sound, taste, smell, touch, thoughts, emotions, all of which are an arising in the field of awareness or consciousness, and therefore all of it is consciousness, and none of it is outside of what I am as consciousness. Now, if anyone's had that appreciation that they might not have had before, that in itself is not, as far as I suggest, not some ultimate truth. And yet it's very important. It's a shift. It's a shift. I describe it as a shift in the neurology. Someone might say, how is it a shift in the neurology if what we're appreciating is that our experience of life is an experience not an experience of form, but an experience arising in consciousness. And any neurology or brain is actually just a concept or part of the world of form that ultimately is formless. Yes, there's that. And yet, maybe what we know, which is the world of form that we have seen to be ultimately all made of consciousness, we can say it's coming from source. It's arising in source. That the awareness, the consciousness is source. But we don't really know what that source is. It may be a brain. It may not. That's not so important. The importance is to realize that this world that we are convinced is a world outside of who I am, a world of form, is in fact always an arising within consciousness, and ultimately everything that appears to be form is made of consciousness. And yet we shouldn't hold on to that too strongly at some point, because then we will relate to the table. We'll keep insisting that the table is consciousness and the car is consciousness. And if you hit yourself over the head with a table, in practice, it feels like you're hitting yourself over the head with a piece of wood, not with a piece of consciousness. And yet, it's all consciousness. So there's a paradox, which is, I think, characterized or can be exemplified with the example of the various layers of physics. You have quantum physics and you have Newtonian physics. Newtonian physics is the physics about the very large, the particles, the form. And quantum physics is about the physics that looks at the very, very small. And if we've spent our life looking at the Newtonian physics, when we find out about the quantum physics, we might have a tendency to say, oh, that's the real and the other is the unreal. I now have seen the truth in the quantum physics. And we negate the Newtonian physics as illusion and hang on to the quantum physics as truth. And I would suggest that that is an error of thinking, and ultimately we need to integrate the quantum physics and the Newtonian physics and see they are two ends of the one object, or the one two ends of the one thing, two sides of a coin. They're inseparable, and they are interdependent and coexist. They're both as real and unreal as each other. And so, after a whole lot of realizations that none of life is as real as we thought it was, realization maybe that I am not the person, I am formless awareness, where we negate the world of form, we negate the person, we might find ourselves coming back and saying, hey, maybe I've been a little bit too harsh with that side of the coin. Maybe I've thrown it out, thinking that the coin only had one side. So I'll bring it to an end there and take some questions. So I'll end off with the notion or the suggestion that really this is all about peace of mind. And as we understand life differently, as we see it differently, then more and more things that are dependent on seeing something that hasn't been seen fall into place. And ultimately it all leads to us being able to experience life without suffering. Still pain, not a life of pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. It'll be a mix of sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. But the suffering that came by thinking that who I am requires life to be perfect, perfect, perfect. For life to be pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. For the other to treat me in a way that is pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. That whole set of psychological narrative falls away. And we could say that that is silence. It isn't silence in some absolute sense, it's silence of the thinking mind. And when there's silence of the thinking mind, the deeper aspect of ourself, which is an aspect of, at least when we come back and say, well, I have to live life, whether it's real or not real, I have to live it as if it is real. Then we come back and say, well, I am the human being. And I know the human being has consciousness functioning through it. And that consciousness, that awareness, is a core aspect of the life experience. And that allows us to drop down into a dimension of the human being that we didn't appreciate was there. So it's all about peace of mind in daily living. Hello, Holger.
Hello, Roger. I really don't know what to say right now, but there's lots of gratitude.
Mm-hmm. Well,
so
beautiful.
beautiful. on a practical level, not to waste your time here, I always had this idea, I held myself back so much from being involved in life. And on a level of business, I have this idea, I don't want to participate in destroying this planet.
Mm-hmm.
Because whatever we do on one level, this is all just my old thinking, something get destroyed. I mean, even walking over grass kind of, it sounds funny, but you maybe step on an ant or squeeze the grass or something. I mean, I was from a physical point of view, I was always very concerned of not getting destroyed. As a young child, I was clinically dead for some minutes, and I don't remember anything from this. But yeah, what a paradox. And I don't even know right now what I want to say, but there was or still is some resistance inside, just to be with the flow of life. But things are getting better, and it's such a joy just to listen to you, how simple it is on one level. How you share it. I mean, it's fascinating. It's fantastic.
Well, I have a suggestion in relation. Well, it is simple when it's simple, and I guess if the system isn't seeing what I'm describing, it can seem extremely complicated. So hopefully there are some dropping in to a place of simplicity. That's great. When it comes to the practical engaging in life, you might see that some of these ideas in a way are psychological or concepts that are in resistance with this particular life, because we can have the concept that says I shouldn't destroy, I shouldn't damage, I shouldn't hurt. And if that concept is taken too far, now it's very good for a concept to be taken too far when it's interfering with an opposite concept. One concept that is the opposite of a deeply ingrained problematic concept can be very useful at tempering the existing belief or way of being. But it can easily swing to the other side. And if we've held on to that as some sort of absolute truth, which in a way we needed to have done in order for it to dissolve the opposite, but at some point holding on to it as an absolute truth will probably turn into a resistance to life. Because an example of that is the Jain religion, for example, take the notion of don't kill to the extreme, such that the orthodox Jains will wear mouth covers or masks so as to not inhale microscopic organisms and kill them. Now, our thinking, maybe microscopic organisms aren't going to die if they're inhaled. But anyway, the point is that it's a good example of how our human thinking can take something to an extreme. And even that's not taking it to the extreme, because if you took it to the absolute extreme, you would become frozen. You wouldn't be able to move, because, as you said, you don't know whether you're going to step on an ant or whether any movement you do, you don't know what effect that will have on something else. And so we can maybe appreciate at a certain point in time, and maybe you're getting an inkling of this, that our ideas can get in the way of us just letting go. And maybe being alive is by default the process of destroying, or the process of change. Because if we call it destroying, we might then have problem with it. But destroying might be just like a forest fire. It destroys some things and it becomes the basis of growth and the new. So I remember at some point I was convinced that we needed to be able to live without money, because I saw the shortcomings of the money system. And so I put a lot of effort for some years into trying to reduce my dependency on money and try and be self-sufficient. And at some point I realized I'm just in resistance to what is. I'm in resistance to this life with its structure, which is an economic structure. And at that point, there was a surrendering and a seeing that my idea that, the money structure is not ideal, and I think that's a fair assessment. But the fact that it's not ideal doesn't mean it needs to be different. And so letting go of our concepts, if we are holding them too rigidly, can be very freeing.
Wow, beautiful. Yes, so much. Yeah, I can relate to the frozen part, and like a form of madness on one level. But so beautiful to hear you, and now it's almost a year, I believe, or even longer, and it's things are really shifting. I mean, very subtle, but there's more space, more inner space, more peace, and so amazing to see that my happiness is really not in the flow of life. I mean, what a madness to run around and to always hunt after pleasures, where the whole thing is already here, whole and complete.
Yeah, including the world of destruction. So, even though it sounds idealistic, I guess, insisting on a world that has no destruction might even be, it's a form of insisting my happiness is to be found in the world of no destruction. And it's a subtle way of undermining our deeper understanding. My happiness is not dependent on life being the way I would like it to be, or the way that is ideal. It's about being happy with the way life is now. By all means, if there's something you can do that will improve things, do that. But I would suggest, if someone is doing things to improve with an intensity that gets in the way of their happiness being there first, it's putting the cart before the horse.
So instead of destruction, maybe just to call it conversion?
Yes, or even to say, maybe I just need to let life be and just do in each moment whatever I think or feel to do, which really means let life be and let my ideas of how life should be. And then we might become a bit carefree in a way that, if we think about it, a lot of people would say, that would be very unfortunate for you to just stop prioritizing saving the world, for example. And I'd suggest that if we stop prioritizing something like saving the world, if it is coming from some investment, and which really means the psychological self is being maintained in that, I would suggest that if everyone did that, not that everyone can, but if it happened that everyone stopped trying to save the world, or trying to, if everyone stopped functioning from the place of the psychological self, there wouldn't be any problem. There wouldn't be racism, there wouldn't be attack, there wouldn't be violence, there wouldn't be destruction. And we're convinced that we need to solve the problems with our attachment to outcomes. And I really advocate that if we see all of the problems are born from the psychological self in the first place, not only the attitude, the problem of our attitude to life, but even the way that our practices have developed are developments from the greediness of the psychological self. So if that psychological self was diminished, and that's what I'm encouraging, and at the basis of the psychological self are all of these ideas of good and bad, and even the preference to move towards the good is maybe keeping the psychological self in place. So our solution, or what we think is the solution, may actually be part of the problem.
Thank you, Roger. I deeply resonate with what you share. And I started meeting with 10, I believe it is 10 Zoom friends, all interested in non-duality.
Mm-hmm.
And we meet maybe like three times a week. And it's such a joy, such a fun, and we keep it very simple and delightful, but it's so good to be connected with other human beings who have this non-dual understanding, and it's such a gift. It's so beautiful.
It's very nice to hear. Ramesh used to say it's all about, ultimately, life is about interhuman relationship. And so he says happiness in life means happiness in interhuman relationship, or harmony in interhuman relationship. And his explanation of harmony is where you simply don't hate the other, where you understand the other, where the other, even if there is disagreement, is seen to be right as well as you being right. Meaning it's not about some absolute right and some absolute wrong. It's about the appreciation that we are all, in whatever position we take, expressing what is right for us, and it's not about making it right relative to some absolute, but appreciating that we are all instruments of source, instruments of life. And in appreciating that, it's the attitude of separation that is falling away. And so we're seeing that each human is being lived, and that there isn't a right and a wrong way of being lived. There is just life happening. So hopefully in your meetings, there is, I suspect in the meetings, especially if it's people that are exposed to these sort of teachings, there is going to be more capacity for the resistance and the arguing to get cut off quicker and quicker, where we might have difference of opinions, but actually they're just opinions arising in life. And if we can let them be and move on without getting hung up on them, then that is harmony with the other.
Wonderful. Lots of gratitude here. Thank you so much, Roger.
Thank you, Olga. Hi, Terence.
Hello. Hi, Roger, thanks. I really appreciate all your videos on YouTube, and I really like the metaphor of all of awareness or consciousness just being this big soup of perceptions, sensory data, even thoughts. And I guess the the end of suffering comes when you shift, when your sense of self or your sense of identity shifts from being a individual body mind to being the whole soup, and realizing you are the soup. And I sometimes can feel that when I'm sitting quietly by myself, and the sense of being a personal self falls away and there's only the soup. But the moment I go about doing daily activity, I'm back. The feeling of being an individual body mind arises again. And I was wondering if you could talk about what is, say something to the process of the shifting of identity, and what particular practices are helpful in becoming, in sort of making more stable your identity as the soup rather than as the individual, and have that become more and more dominant in your experience. Because yes, certainly when you realize there's only the soup, things are a lot more peaceful. But it's hard to make, or at least maybe for one just recently coming to that realization, it's hard to make that the dominant aspect of your experience. I mean, is there a gradual transition process, and how can you speed that up, or how can you facilitate stabilizing as the soup? Is there some wisdom you could impart on that?
Yeah. Yes, it's a good question. I'll just this identification as the soup, as opposed to the individual person, is one way of describing it, and especially based on the exploration we did today, you can say from that point of view, yes, we can call it that. But ultimately, I would say what we are is the person. However, we can find a platform, we can find a dimension in the person that is feels much less personal than when we only know ourselves as the form aspect of the person. So at first, I think it's good to say, okay, I am not the person. I am the soup, the awareness. So we'll run with that, because it's in line with your question. How do we, how does the process deepen? So we'll run with calling it, I am not the person, but I am the awareness. And it, in my description of things, it is a deepening. It is something that happens with practice, but the practice isn't something that the person needs to do. In fact, if the person says, how do I make this happen quicker? And if that's not addressed, what may be happening is that the identification with the person, as opposed to the soup, is being reinforced with that attitude. How do I make it happen? And so I would rephrase it and say, it is happening. Life, happens day after day after day after day, and change is happening throughout the days. And we're convinced that we decide and are responsible for how the days go. But if you look back on the last 3 days, you might be able to see the perspective that you sort of got ushered through the days. Sure, there was what we can say is decision making, but when you look at that decision making, it's heavily influenced by the circumstance you found yourself in. You know, the crossroads you find yourself at dictate the decision. And so if the day didn't unfold a particular way, you wouldn't have had to make certain decisions. And so even those decisions we can then start to see as consequences, essentially, of a situation we found ourselves in that we didn't really know was going to be how the day unfolded. And so we can start to see that I'm just very much like a leaf floating down the river, the stream of life, going more or less where the stream takes us. And in large part, that's a large part of the answer, because we have to have that attitude that I can't make it happen, but if I see that my life is a life of seeking, meaning that I am a leaf going down the stream, and consistently the stream is taking me down a path of seeking, where there is a motivation to seek, there is an availability of information, there is a thinking that happens. So all of these things are, maybe taken for granted, but any number of people could tell you, I have no motivation to seek, and they're not seekers, because the motivation doesn't arise, the interest doesn't arise, that life has put in place different interests. And so they get ushered down a different stream because of the interests, because of the preferences, because of the makeup that person happens to be. So the very fact that seeking is happening is already the process happening. When we see the process start to take on an even more particular form, so within seeking, when we find ourselves more interested in dropping out of thinking, and maybe start seeing that happen more and more frequently, that is a movement that is a bit like macheting your way through a jungle, or through a path, through bushland. And the more times that you tread that path, the more defined the path gets. And it becomes easier and easier to traverse. You become more and more familiar with where the entrance to the path is. And so then it becomes something that is much more natural, or the movement becomes much more second nature or first nature, the more times that it happens. Just like strengthening a muscle that has never been used. If there's a muscle that's never been used, the the connections aren't even there to be able to move it. It's like wiggling your ears. Some people can't wiggle their ears, and with enough effort and practice, those muscles in the ears can get activated. You can create a link between the brain and those muscles, so that the ears can move where previously they couldn't. And this dropping into being, dropping out of thinking, dropping into the experience of not being involved in what is happening, just even for 10 seconds every other day, or 10 seconds every hour if it happens every hour. And this isn't an instruction to Terence to do this, but it's rather a description of what might happen as part of the unfolding of the seeking. And ironically, the description in itself may be part of how that happens more frequently. So Nisargadatta suggested abide in I am. That was his way of saying drop into being, tread that path more regularly so it becomes ingrained, so that it becomes who you know yourself as. So abide in I am, and that that phrasing abide in I am, to someone that has no context or no frame of reference from their own experience, they go, what does that mean? Abide in I am. Hopefully, you might have an inkling about what abide in I am means. It's linked to know yourself as the soup. And how do you know yourself as the soup? It really has to do with moments where you're thinking about the past and the future and where you're going and how you're going to get there, just get cut off. Primarily because somewhere in the system we've been reminded enough that that's not where you're going to find yourself. You're not going to find yourself in that obsessive thinking. So it's, if life delivers enough reminders that start to interfere with the old habitual movement, that is the deepening that allows us to eventually live from a position connected to oneself, where when painful situations arise, there is a knowing that that's life, and that the deeper part of myself is not actually affected. It's not a knowing of the intellect, it's a knowing of one's own experience, where you find that it is possible for life to unfold where pain, where things change, where plane trips get cancelled, or people we love die, and yet we find experientially that there is a groundedness that remains. There is a stability of our knowing who we are that is unshakable, as opposed to previously, where we found ourselves battered from pillar to post every time something didn't quite go right, or we were challenged by someone, there was a conflict, there was a disagreement, someone was rude to us, and all of these things are taken personally, primarily because there was no groundedness in this deeper sense of I am, I exist now, not needing life to take me somewhere in order for me to know my existence, but to appreciate in each moment I am.
Thank you. So, I appreciate your point of how the desire to facilitate the process is also reinforcement of the separate identity.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're, I guess, if the experience of life unfolding it seems heavily predicated on turning away from thoughts of the past, thoughts of the future, and so forth. And it would seem like practices like focusing on body sensations
Mm-hmm.
seem to facilitate de-emphasizing the attention placed on those troublesome thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
But then again, I suppose that apparent shifting of focus is also just an unfolding within the soup, I guess, and there's no one to do it. But yet, paradoxically, it feels like I trained myself to pay more attention to body sensation than thought, or attempted to, and I suppose the feeling like I did it is also an arising in the soup.
Exactly. Yeah.
But yet it's hard to reconcile that, because it feels like I had to do something to get to this point, which kind of feels like an intermediary stage towards maybe really feeling like everything's just unfolding, or like in one of your other videos you talked about how everything's just happening. And it seems like it certainly feels like I'm at some intermediary point towards that, and yeah, it's hard to reconcile.
Well,
Is there anything?
I'll throw something in that might make it much easier. You said it seems like I had to train myself to do, focusing on the body sensations in order to interfere with the thinking. So I would agree that if focusing on the body sensations happens, it does tend to cut off thinking or replace thinking. It brings us into a presence with something happening now that is not conceptual. The body sensation is essentially a dropping out of thinking about something in the head and coming into presence with the body. So if that movement happens, yes, there is a dropping out of thinking. The point that we can appreciate, that we can really see, is that life trained you to do that. Not you trained to do that, but life put a video or a book in front of you where someone suggested bringing attention onto body sensations. And that was new conditioning delivered in life that became part of your up-to-date conditioning. And if life didn't deliver that new conditioning, it wouldn't have become part of your up-to-date conditioning, and it then wouldn't have been something that happened. But life did deliver that new conditioning. It became part of your up-to-date conditioning, both of which were not in your control. And then, being different because of how life has designed you, because of the new conditioning it delivered, then focusing on body sensations happened. And so if you can reframe, and maybe if you investigate that and see what I'm pointing out, then you go, even what I call my practice is really practicing happening, and practicing not by a doer, but practicing by an instrument that life has conditioned in order to function that way. And the more and more this is seen, the more and more appreciation there is. I simply cannot be the doer. Sure, things are happening through me, so focusing on the body is happening, but who is doing it is a particular body-mind organism that has been shaped by life as a result of its genes and up-to-date conditioning.
I see. And the sense of volition falling away, I guess that's also a happening in life. And I guess is that typically a very gradual process?
Well, I'd like to distinguish between the sense of the sense of free will, where it feels like I'm free to move my hand to the right or move my hand to the left. So that sense of free will always be there, and it's a gift. If it wasn't there, then we would feel like slaves. We would feel like puppets at the end of a string. And what this concept is saying we are puppets at the end of a string, and at the same time, we've been given this gift of free will where it feels like it's my doing. And so if we can reconcile that it feels like my doing, but actually my decision or my actions are happening according to my genes and up-to-date conditioning that I wasn't in control of. And that's the paradox. That's the happy zone where it's not one or the other. And if we can reconcile that there isn't a separate doer, what's important is the belief in doership falls away. And the belief in doership is subtly different from the feeling of free will. I'm very glad that the belief in personal doership has fallen away, but I'm very glad that that doesn't equate with the absence of the feeling of free will. So you can think about that.
You don't think the feeling of free will has to do with the feeling of doership also? Because I think it's not too hard to understand intellectually. Like I like your description. You are just a product of your genes and up-to-date conditioning. And I intellectually, as a concept, I believe that's 100% true. Mm-hmm. So in terms of conceptual belief, I completely believe that, but it just doesn't feel like that sometimes. Like you made a mistake. You're like, oh, I screwed up. It feels like that, but intellectually, I know, well, I'm just a product of everything I learned in my biology and all the interactions I had. I totally get that, but I guess it's the feeling that changes, and it certainly feels like that feeling of free will has a lot to do with it. It almost seems like it's almost the same as the feeling of doership.
It will feel like that, because as the belief in personal doership weakens, what we will feel is that I'm being lived. It will feel like I'm being moved by my genes and up-to-date conditioning, which is really just a revelation of what's always been happening, but we start to appreciate it. Even as I speak, I feel like the speaking, but really because I can't see the opposite, right? It's like I feel like the speaking is just happening and there's no one doing it. It's just there is this body-mind organism that has been shaped by life, and you ask a question and then that inspires a response. And it really feels on one level like there's no doer and it's just happening. And we can, when that shift comes in, and I know from personal experience, I argued with Ramesh that the feeling of free will has gone because I appreciate that I am just, that speaking is happening. And it was only when I really started looking at the nuanced difference that I realized that the feeling of free will, the feeling that, so there was very much the appreciation that speaking is happening, and at the same time, because there's layers of our experience, that's what's important. If we don't appreciate there are layers, as we go through the process, our attention basically focuses on one layer, and when it's focused on one layer, we might see the falling away of the belief of doership and the replacing of the belief of doership with the sense that life is happening. And when attention is on that, we might become convinced I have no sense of free will. Whereas what's fallen away is the belief in doership, and what has revealed is the automatic happening of speaking. If we then move our attention to another layer that happens simultaneously, we realize, oh, I was wrong conceptually to say there is no feeling of free will, because when I stand at the fridge, even knowing that I am being lived, I have the feeling that I can choose whatever I like. It does feel like Roger can choose, and that Roger does have the feeling that he's he's choosing the yogurt over the salad, for example. And simultaneously, I know I feel that choice is a happening. And it's only when we can then shift between the two layers and appreciate that they are two separate layers arising concurrently to make up the experience of Roger, that we then can appreciate the nuance. It's the belief in doership that has changed, and there is a feeling of free will, and the feeling of free will and the falling away of the belief in personal doership are not incongruent. That can coexist. The absence of the belief in personal doership, even the presence that life is a happening, and also the existence of the feeling of free will. Now, earlier on, if someone isn't prone to have been given a teaching that is particularly focused on concepts and nuances, which, might be too much at some point, the difference between free will and doership might be indistinguishable. And so what I'm talking about won't be appreciated. And to be frank, if someone came to me, I wouldn't and said, "What is all this suffering about?" I could just say it's because we believe that we have free will. That's probably the most direct way of getting the point to that person, because of the way that the definition we have of free will. Down the track, we might start bringing in these nuances, which, the nuance between the belief of personal doership, the feeling that I'm being lived, and the difference between that and the feeling of free will in the moment.
Do you feel like you can appreciate those apparently contradictory feelings simultaneously, or is it a fast switching?
No,
it's analogous to how they say how neurologists say there's no such thing as multitasking. It's really a very fast switching of attention from one thing to another. And do you kind of look at it in a similar way? Like it's like a fast switching between two apparently contradictory perspectives?
You can answer that either way, because technically we might not be able to hold two things in one moment. But if the switching can be so quick, it can appear that they are simultaneous. If it is switching back and forth 1,000 times a second, for example, they can seem like they are two things in the one moment. So practically speaking, I would say it's a simultaneous appreciation. It's a paradox that is able to be held as one thing. Technically, it might be that there is a switching between the two, but I would look at those two things able to be part of the one thought, because they are two things that are on different planes. The doership, the belief in doership, and the feeling of free will, because at the end, so that is the ultimate paradox, what you have just described, to be able to hold those two things that seem on one level as a contradiction, but when they stop being a contradiction, it's very easy to hold them together, because they simply aren't a contradiction. They're seen to be two complementary things, just like when you can hold the world of form and Newtonian physics and at the same time hold quantum physics and not have to choose one or the other. If our understanding of the quantum physics and Newtonian physics is at a certain stage, we might be forced to choose one or the other. And then when things fall into place enough, we go, no, it's not a choice of one or the other. It is one and the other. So even this notion that you're not the doer is really saying that Roger is a result, or the human being is a result of his genes and up-to-date conditioning, not in its control. And so we say, not my doing. But when you look at it when it's not narrowly phrased like that, because it's phrased that way to make a point, right? That if I say something embarrassing, attitudinally, if I can appreciate that I said something embarrassing because of my genes and up-to-date conditioning, essentially, I was forced by life and that situation to say something embarrassing. And so we say your attitude can be one of, it's not my doing, which basically means we don't turn it into shame and all of that. But who did it? And I'd say I did it. Roger did it. Who said the embarrassing thing? I said it. Roger. But what is Roger? Roger is a result of genes and up-to-date conditioning. But that is Roger. It does. So it is my doing, and it's not my doing. What it means is I did it, but what I did was the only thing that I could have done given how life has shaped me up to this moment and the circumstance I found myself in. So in holding the nuance correctly, I'd say, well, I live as if I'm Roger, because I am Roger, and as if I did everything, because on one level I did it, but on the level of my attitude, I don't see any point in feeling shame, because I did it, but I couldn't have done it differently. And so this is the game of having concepts that say I am not the doer, which is very useful at undoing the concept of I am the doer, and then not having that concept run too wild such that it leaves us with an intellectual idea of myself that is not aligned with who we really are. Same with the notion I am consciousness or I am awareness. It's very useful to see the aspect of the human that is consciousness and awareness. But if it runs too wild, then we will say, I am consciousness and I am not the body. So, we could carry on forever, but I appreciate your questions, Terence. It seems like you're going through an interesting place, and that your intellect is a tool, is helping you along, because your questions are good ones.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I think you had a very good impact today on my up-to-date conditioning.
Great.
Thank you.
Drop in anytime.